In the pre-dawn hours, a house catches fire in Wisconsin. Investigators determine that the blaze is a smokescreen designed to hide a more horrific act of violence. But the heat of the flames leaves the crime trail cold. In southern Florida, a series of fires becomes more than a coincidence. People are dying, and a community is frightened. Detectives must work quickly to calm fears and catch the killer before he strikes again. At a crime scene, everything is considered a potential clue. But a fire can destroy everything in its path, challenging forensic investigators at every turn and making each arson a trial by fire. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. "2:30 in the morning, November 25th, 1996. Most of La Crosse, Wisconsin slept. But one of its residents woke up to an alarming sight.
Your neighbor's house is on fire? What's the address there, please?
He noticed smoke pouring from his neighbor's house. Fire trucks raced to the scene, arriving moments later to find it consumed by flames. If anyone was home, firefighters feared they were trapped inside. La Crosse firefighter Dan Skiles knew he and his men had to get in quickly if they hoped to get anyone out alive. But there appeared to be no way in.
So instead of my normal routine of putting my shoulder into that door and pushing it open, I decided to sit down and use my legs to kick the door open.
Firefighter Skiles kicked open the door and discovered the floor of the kitchen completely destroyed by the fire. With no path to guide them, they relied on each other, making their way through the flames and looking for anyone who was trapped inside.
The person on the nozzle yelled out that he had a victim. We picked him up. I dragged him as far as I could before I ran out of air.
Despite their best efforts, firefighters pulled a man's lifeless body out of the burning rubble. It was the homeowner, 64-year-old Donald Harmasic. And firefighter Dan Skiles suspected something else was wrong.
There was blood on his head, and I thought that was unusual for a victim in a house fire to have any type of blood on him.
It was at that moment firefighters suspected they were dealing with something more than an accident. The body was transported to the morgue for autopsy. La Crosse, Wisconsin detectives Dave Schatzley and Carrie Jaholski interviewed the neighbor who phoned police. And although he saw the flames, he said he did not see or hear anything out of the ordinary. Once the fire department declared the house safe for entry, fire investigators went to work. Deputy Fire Marshal Gene Brink began the preliminary investigation to determine the fire's point of origin.
A fire investigator, in determining the cause of the fire, starts in the area of least damage, the outside of the house or the living room where there was no fire, and works back to the area of most damage.
The house was cluttered with books and magazines. Detectives opened them and found money hidden inside. But the victim's wallet was found empty on the table. As firefighters packed up, Fire Marshal Brink went down to the basement and inspected the debris, looking for some explanation for the blaze.
I want to show you why I'm convinced we had a set fire here. In our investigation, we determined that the fire had started in the basement. That's where the greatest burn had occurred. We found one area under the kitchen where the fire had burned on top of a pile of magazines. There was no heat-producing device in the area. We had a set fire at that one particular place. This was an arson.
La Crosse arson investigators checked the outside perimeter of the house. They needed to find out who started the fire and why. They noticed a broken basement window. Investigators believed whoever started the fire may have entered through that window. In the snow, one of them discovered an undisturbed shoe print leading away from the house. Since it was dark, he covered the print with a metal trash can in order to preserve this possible clue. The autopsy was performed at the Veterans Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. The medical examiner found deep circular wounds in the victim's skull. The force of the blows caused severe hemorrhaging and trauma, rendering him unconscious and unable to escape the fire. Now, along with arson, authorities believed they were also investigating a murder.
Okay, everybody, we want to get a briefing in and get some job assignments.
Early
for
the next
case
morning,
here.
at the La Crosse Police Department, investigators compared the information they gathered so far. Detective Joe Dunham was one of the lead investigators on the case.
The coroner thought it was a gunshot, but then he determined later it was a blunt instrument to the head that killed Mr. Harmachek. There's a footprint on the east side of the house in snow.
Detectives also needed to follow up on the most promising clue so far, the footprint left in the back of the house. At the crime scene, technicians arrived to make a cast of the frozen shoe print. The snow's hardened crystalline structure captured the most intricate detail, but it had to be handled carefully so as not to destroy the print. Before a cast was attempted, the shoe print was photographed, just in case. Hot sulfur, which solidifies on contact with the cold snow, was used as the casting medium. The sulfur hardens almost instantly, ensuring the snow does not melt before the cast is created. It recorded every groove and pattern of the shoe print. The newly formed cast was sent to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. Inside the house, blood spatter stained the furniture and the surrounding floor. Forensic scientist Nick Stalkey reconstructed the fatal scenario.
The stains that were on the front of this chest of drawers were 2 to 6 millimeters in size. Those are indicative of stains that you would see at a beating or a stabbing.
He stretched pieces of string back from the blood spatter to determine the position of the victim at the moment of the attack.
By the point of convergence of the bloodstains, I was able to determine that Mr. Harmachek was beaten just in front of this chest of drawers. We did find a hammer that was in the area of these bloodstains.
The chest of drawers and the hammer were sent to the crime lab for analysis. A La Crosse police officer spoke with Shirley Otto, the victim's longtime companion.
So right now you can't think of anybody that would want to do any harm to him?
She and Donald Harmachek had been together for over 20 years.
No.
She told the officer they had a good relationship, that Donald was well-liked, and everyone called him by his nickname, Pops. Shirley also told the officer that Donald had been upset recently because his house had been repeatedly burglarized.
I think he kept most of it there because he didn't trust banks.
La Crosse police detectives Joe Dunham and Brad Berkey looked into police reports and arrest records involving burglaries of the Harmasic residence. They found no shortage of names. It appeared perpetrators considered Donald Harmasic an easy mark.
He was someone that we knew kept money in his residence, and he had been targeted in the past by various burglars.
Police went to question a known local petty thief named Adam Tallbridge. But when he heard the police, he ran. Tallbridge looked like a promising suspect.
What is this all about?
Apparently running for a reason.
Back at the station, he denied any involvement with the Harmasic homicide. Tallbridge claimed he panicked when he heard the police. That is why he ran. He agreed to cooperate and allowed his tennis shoes to be tested. They were sent out for analysis to the state crime lab, where forensic scientist Jerry Kotajarvi was analyzing the footprint casts from the crime scene.
There are a lot of shoes that have the same size and tread designs, but it's the unique characteristics that identifies that shoe to that impression. Like cuts and missing pieces and wear and so on.
He determined that the footwear worn at the scene was an Airwalk tennis shoe, the same type worn by Tallbridge. But when he compared the casts to the sneakers, he found the shoes were the wrong size. Adam Tallbridge was not their man. Then Kotajarvi discovered something unusual. There were actually two separate and distinct shoe prints, one on top of the other. He concluded they were now looking for two suspects, not one. Detective Berkey realized they had to rethink their investigation.
Detective Dunham and I both believed that there might be more to this. I mean, that information pointed us in the right direction.
Investigators still had no idea who killed Donald Harmasic, and they faced an even greater challenge. They were now looking for two suspects, and their hope was that the newly discovered shoe prints would lead them straight to the killers. 64-year-old Donald Harmasic was murdered and his house set on fire to cover up the crime. Investigators discovered they were now searching for two suspects, but so far the crime scene yielded a limited number of clues, and detectives Brad Berkey and Joe Dunham were frustrated.
When you burn a body, you take a lot of evidence with it, and also when you burn the home, you take a lot of evidence there. It was a challenge. We had a big challenge ahead of us because we had no suspects in this brutal murder.
At the crime lab, forensic scientists continued their investigation. Nick Stalkey studied the victim's blood-spattered cabinet. Soot marks and spatter indicated that one of the drawers was partially open at the time of the murder. The chest of drawers provided Nick Stalkey with important information.
The individual was beaten just in front of this chest of drawers, and then the drawers were repositioned, and then the fire started. It told us then that not only did the individuals beat the victim, but they also then ransacked that house after he was down and bleeding, and then started the fire and left.
Investigators now believe the perpetrator set the fire with the intent to cover up an even greater crime. At the Wisconsin State Crime Lab, forensic scientist Ken Olson tested debris from the burned house. He believed a flammable liquid was used to start the blaze.
It's very difficult to just take
materials that are present to start a fire. But with an ignitable liquid, you can accelerate that fire and get it going faster.
Liquid accelerants leave traces behind that slowly evaporate. The debris collected was placed inside a can along with a carbon strip. Carbon absorbs any traces of the accelerant left behind. The can is sealed and then heated to 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
I then take that paint can with the charcoal strip inside, place it into the oven.
After heating for 16 hours, the carbon strip is then put into a gas chromatograph that analyzes the chemical components of the accelerant.
I take that vial and put it on the instrument, and it's automated, injects the solvent into the instrument, and I'm looking for any known accelerants that are there.
Every chemical has a unique molecular fingerprint. The chromatograph reveals that molecular structure.
I examined the residues that I recovered and found the residues of gasoline in 3 of the samples that were collected from the scene.
Investigators turned to the community, and they set up a Crime Solvers tip line. The leads began to pour in. One of the callers claimed a man named Todd Carpenter knew something about the murder. Detectives brought Carpenter in for questioning. He began to spell out his involvement, telling investigators he was contacted by 2 men.
He was approached by Nathan Lindell and Josh Lindell, and that he was a driver and they were just going there for a burglary.
According to Carpenter, the Lindell brothers heard a rumor that Donald Harmasic kept lots of cash in his house, and they wanted it. The brothers offered Carpenter money to drive the getaway car. Carpenter told the detectives he stayed with the car while Nathaniel and Josh Lindell committed the burglary.
He waited outside while Josh and Nathan Lindell went inside the residence looking for money and rummaged around the basement and went upstairs looking for money. And at that time, they stumbled across Donald Harmachek.
Afterwards, the brothers instructed him to drive to the top of Granddad Bluff, a secluded spot overlooking the city of La Crosse. There, they built a fire and burned the clothes they had been wearing, including their shoes. Carpenter was surprised when Nathaniel told him the man inside the house was, quote, toast by now.
What's he doing? Tyler, come on, let's get out of here.
The brothers paid Carpenter his money. In total, they had stolen $300 from Harmasic. Carpenter said he got nervous when he heard about the murder on the news the next day. Detectives ran the Lindell brothers' names through the computer. Josh Lindell's record was clean, but Nathaniel had a rap sheet riddled with prior arrests, including burglary.
Okay, Marcus.
Investigators began to believe Carpenter, but they had no concrete evidence to back up his story. In the hopes of getting some, detectives convinced him to wear a wire. Maybe they could catch Nathaniel incriminating himself. Carpenter went to see Nathaniel.
Hey, Marcus, man, what's up? What's going on, man?
He told him the police were asking a lot of questions.
Hey, calm down. Hey, come in quick.
He said he was scared. He didn't know what to do or say.
No?
They've just been coming by my work, asking me all kinds of questions, about who I was with and who I hang
Nathaniel
out with.
played it cool. He indicated knowledge of the crime, but said nothing that could actually incriminate himself.
He was telling him to stay cool and just, don't tell him anything, and that those SOBs, they ain't gonna get nothing out of me.
They were convinced Nathaniel Lindell was the mastermind. But the wired conversation was no proof. Since Carpenter couldn't help them anymore, detectives hoped Josh Lindell could.
He did agree to speak with us, and that surprised me. His initial statement to us, he took the blame.
Detectives finally got the break they needed. But the extreme violence of the crime and their strongest piece of evidence, the shoe prints, pointed to two killers. Detectives knew they needed more if they were to catch them both. La Crosse, Wisconsin detectives were deep in the middle of the arson murder investigation of 64-year-old Donald Harmasik. The footprints found in the snow led investigators to two suspects, the Lindell brothers. Detectives Joe Dunham and Brad Berkey had placed Josh Lindell in custody. Although he claimed he acted alone, the detectives knew differently. Detective Brad Berkey hoped Josh would give up his brother.
I believed that he was involved, but I never expected him in the interview to tell us that he was the one that did this. I fully expected him to tell us that his brother was more involved than he was, and that surprised me. He was remorseful that he did this, felt bad about it, and he was trying to make some amends by telling us what he did.
Although Josh was taking the blame, in order to prove their case, detectives needed him to reveal his brother's involvement. Josh appeared nervous. He said he had never been in trouble with the law. And after hours of questioning, Josh Lindell finally admitted the whole story. He said he and Nathaniel broke in through the basement window, stepping on each other's footprints to obscure their tracks and to throw off police.
So we're gonna look for those.
They found Donald Harmasik asleep on the couch and panicked.
I was scared. It scared me, and I panicked and I hit him over the head.
Are you willing to speak with us in regard to this?
He said his brother Nathan also repeatedly struck the victim in the head with a hammer and left him for dead.
What's your present address?
Then they set the house on fire to cover up their crime. Josh's story matched Todd Carpenter's.
Exactly. Tell him to come on. Let's go.
He said they drove up to the bluff so he and his brother could burn their clothes and destroy evidence. Murder was never part of the plan. Although by the time they left, the plan had fallen apart.
Yeah, we weren't sure. I thought maybe we found him.
After Josh's confession, investigators had what they needed to bring in Nathaniel for breaking and entering, arson, and the murder of Donald Harmasik. They arrested him at the apartment he shared with his roommate.
And place you in the squad car after he searches you. When we get down to the police station, then we'll discuss.
He was
this at
handcuffed
that
and
time.
taken to the
Okay?
police station, where he was booked. Detectives also came armed with a search warrant.
The shoes here.
They questioned Nathaniel's roommate and searched for evidence. Even though Josh said they burned the shoes they wore, investigators collected another pair at his apartment. At the State Crime Lab, the shoes confiscated from Nathaniel were determined to be Airwalks, the same style and tread design of the shoe print cast. Although not an exact match, the wear pattern was uniquely similar to those worn at the crime scene. Despite the evidence against him and the fact that both Todd Carpenter and his own brother Josh incriminated him, Nathaniel Lindell refused to talk.
He would not speak to us. That's his right, of course. But Nathan is cold-hearted, would do anything.
Based on the evidence, police determined that Nathaniel and Josh Lindell broke into Donald Harmasik's home, intending to burglarize it. Josh was surprised to find the homeowner asleep on the sofa. Harmasik began to stir. Josh panicked. Nathaniel then struck him with the hammer he'd used to break the basement window. beating him unconscious. On their way out, the brothers took the money from the victim's wallet. They set the house on fire to cover up the murder. They then carefully stepped in each other's footprints, hoping to fool the authorities. It didn't turn out that way.
I believe Josh was definitely part of the crime, but he was not the leader of the group. It was Nathan Lindell, his older brother, that was the leader.
On February 3rd, 1998, Nathaniel Lindell was convicted of first-degree murder, burglary, and arson. He was sentenced to life in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 50 years. His brother, Josh Lindell, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life. He will be eligible for parole in 25 years. In exchange for his testimony, Todd Carpenter was not charged. La Crosse homicide detectives narrowed in on one piece of forensic evidence, yielding two suspects who used arson to hide their crime. In Florida, authorities faced an ever-widening challenge as a string of similar fires became more than a coincidence. In the early morning of August 7th, 1993, in Spring Hill, Florida, the Hernando County Fire Department responded to a burning residence. Firefighters raced to the home of 80-year-old Becky Saunders. When they arrived, the flames had already ravaged a large portion of the house. The extreme heat was overwhelming, and the entrances were blocked. But the firefighters did all they could to rescue the elderly resident and salvage her home. It took hours, but the firefighters finally got the fire under control. Forensic specialist Gary Kimball investigated.
Due to the extensive nature of the fire, we ran into some problems. We were unable to examine a lot of the things that we would like to have examined because they just weren't there anymore.
The heat was so intense, any potential evidence was destroyed. Investigators were unable to identify an immediate cause. Firefighters could not save Becky Saunders, an elderly widow who lived alone. She died at the scene. Police interviewed Becky Saunders' neighbor. He told investigators she didn't smoke, but she often fell asleep with the TV and lights on. He mentioned a possible electrical problem. The house had been struck by lightning a month or two earlier. Perhaps it had caused some damage that led to the fire. All the neighbors knew Becky and were eager to talk about her. They said she was in good health and quite independent. Fire investigators asked if anyone saw anything unusual. No one did. The Hernando County Sheriff's Arson Unit, led by Detective Mike Owens, searched for answers. When they could not determine the fire's immediate cause, they needed to consider another possibility: arson.
Arson investigation is not an exact science. It's a big puzzle. You try to take charred remains and then put them back together. We take everything in the room out and try to reproduce the locations of the furniture, everything and anything that was in there, and try and see where you're having low burns, high burns, to see what area the fire actually traveled.
The debris collected from the house was sent to the lab for analysis. Arson expert Carl Chasteen looked for pore patterns or the residue of a flammable chemical, an accelerant, that would indicate arson.
What we're trying to determine is, has there been something added to this fire scene that would cause it to burn faster and hotter than it would if it were an accidental fire. That's what we're looking for. We're looking to see if there's been an accelerant added to the fire.
The photographs revealed the progression of the fire, which started in the bedroom. Investigators still needed to find out the cause of the fire. But with so much of the evidence destroyed, they knew it would not be easy.
In a crime laboratory, we have to be objective. It's not our job to convict somebody or exonerate anyone. It's our job to test the evidence and tell the truth. In this case, we looked at it as closely as we could, and we still could not determine that there was any ignitable liquid in the samples.
At the medical examiner's office, the victim's remains were autopsied. Though her blood showed elevated levels of carbon monoxide, indicating that she had inhaled smoke, Dr. Valerie Rao wasn't confident that it was enough to suffocate her. The poor condition of her remains made further analysis impossible.
Because the investigation really did not lead anywhere, it was decided by the medical examiner to call it undetermined.
Without any evidence to indicate otherwise, Becky Saunders' death remained a mystery. Investigators were left with unanswered questions. The firefighters in Hernando County would soon find themselves battling another blaze. But maybe this could provide some answers. An elderly Spring Hill, Florida resident, Becky Saunders, died trapped inside her burning house. Investigators were unable to determine the actual cause of the fire.
Fire rescue, what is your emergency?
10 days later, the Hernando County dispatcher received a call. Another house was on fire, and an elderly couple was trapped inside.
Wait, sir, they'll be right there.
Firefighters entered the smoke-filled house and saw a woman collapsed on the floor. They carefully carried her to safety. A man was trapped unconscious in the back of the house.
I've got a second victim.
The victims, Mr. and Mrs. Ted Burton, were an elderly couple in poor health. They were rushed to the hospital. Forensic supervisor Russ Knodel investigated.
Someone had broken into the home, had beaten the elderly lady. Her husband in the bedroom heard the commotion, came out. He was beaten, and then they attempted to set a drape on fire and left.
Investigators noticed a bystander engrossed by the rescue. Because entry was forced and the victims were beaten, detectives questioned everyone in the area, including the bystander. His name was Brian Searsley. He said he lived in the neighborhood and that he'd seen nothing suspicious. He agreed to let investigators swab his hands for the telltale signs of an accelerant. He also allowed them to take an article of clothing for further testing. The fire had gone out only moments after it had started. The arson dog was sent in, and investigators collected debris to test for accelerants. If an accelerant was used, detectives believed it might point them in the direction of a suspect.
There was some alcohol poured in a dish with a candle. The candle was lit and then put underneath the drapes, and the drapes caught on fire.
The rest of the house remained undamaged. It was searched thoroughly, looking for anything out of the ordinary. In the bathroom, investigators noticed a cabinet door open. Not sure what it could mean, the cabinet was dusted for prints. At the State Arson Lab, Brian Searsley's clothes, as well as the swabs and samples from the Burton house, were analyzed. Traces of gasoline were found on his clothes, but there was no evidence of gasoline at the crime scene. He was eliminated as a suspect. Police studied crime scene photographs, hoping to spot something they'd missed. Mrs. Burton suffered from Alzheimer's, and Mr. Burton had lapsed into a coma, so the couple was unable to aid investigators. They found no evidence that the similarities between the Burton fire and the Saunders fire was anything more than coincidence.
Right off the edge of the carport. Now, we know it wasn't a robbery, because as we were going through the home, we opened up the drawer in the bedroom, and that's a picture of the drawer opened up in the bedroom. And if you'll notice, you can start to see a wallet, a man's wallet. When we picked up the wallet and opened it up, it had a lot of cash in it, so we know it wasn't a robbery.
With no known motive and no possible suspects, the evidence baffled investigators. Later that day, another fire was reported in a neighboring town.
Singapore radio. You have fire on the scene now.
We've received a call that there was a fire up in Brookridge. Again, the fire was hot and it had burnt severely to where everything in the bedroom had dropped onto the ground. We processed that scene looking for anything we could find.
Like the first victim, 70-year-old Monique Jenkins had been found burned beyond recognition on her bed. And like the last fire, a bathroom cabinet stood open. Once again, most of the evidence was destroyed. But investigators collected what they could from the smoldering debris. The body was burned beyond recognition. At autopsy, the medical examiner was unable to find the cause of death. The examiners did find the victim's hands were bound with duct tape, rendering her helpless. Examiners found no fingerprints on the tape. Again, there was no clear motive for the crime.
The detectives approach us and they're looking for anything they can find that will forensically link something or someone to these cases. They're wanting to know if we got fingerprints. They're wanting to know if we got any trace evidence, if we found any accelerants, or anything that they can put their hands on to help them in the direction they're going in this case. And at this particular time, we were not able to come up with anything. Very frustrating for the whole team.
Okay, folks, we're here today to review the facts that we've come up with thus far.
Detectives compared evidence gathered at the three fires, hoping to come up with something that would tie them together.
We had a great amount of intense heat inside this master bedroom.
It appears to be some type of home invasion at this point when both the victims were...
The intensity of the blaze indicated an accelerant was used to cover up another crime.
Once we examined the remains, it clearly showed that she had been duct taped with her hands clearly duct taped behind her back. So that's really the first indication that we're dealing with something other than accidental fires.
This was the crucial piece of evidence that began to link the arsons.
Because now we know we had a problem. We felt now we have somebody going around breaking in homes and burning these elderly women up.
Police followed through on several leads. None paid off. Worried, a man checked on his neighbor, Rita Talbot, after he hadn't seen her for a few days. Her front porch was littered with unread newspapers. She didn't answer the door. With the key she had given him, the neighbor entered the house.
Hello? Hello?
He found her in the bedroom, dead. Once again, police were called. They were all too familiar with this neighborhood. In fact, Rita Talbot lived on the same block as Becky Saunders, the first fire victim.
Scott?
Hey, Russ.
What do we got going?
Looks like another one. I haven't been in the scene yet, but we have, we're doing some processing out on the side of the house. We've got an open window, looks like it could be our point of entry. And
But this crime scene was different. The house did not catch fire. Detective Mike Owens noticed the stains around the bed.
What we've got is, looks like a pour pattern, Scott. Looks like we've got some alcohol bottles up there on the bed, and what they may have done, or might have been done here, is alcohol poured in the carpet, and not enough with this carpet to substantiate a burn, but it melted all the carpet down. Look at this pattern. Look how deep it is.
how about the bed? Did the bed get anything?
Looking at the bed, if you look over here, we don't have
The crime scene technicians dusted for fingerprints. This time, they found one. The print was lifted and sent to the lab for analysis. They collected samples of the carpet, hoping the fibers would yield clues. Cigarette butts and some empty alcohol bottles were recovered. After weeks of frustration, this tragic crime scene produced several key clues. Now, detectives hoped the forensic evidence would bring them closer to capturing the killer. For almost 2 months, detectives had been tracking a killer who was wreaking havoc on a peaceful Florida neighborhood. At the most recent crime scene, police found several clues, including a fingerprint they hoped would lead them to a suspect. Detective Scott Bierweiler believed the recovery of this evidence was crucial.
The past houses of the victims, of the deceased, had been burned. A lot of the evidence had been destroyed. We were not real successful in obtaining evidence. So we were all encouraged going into this house, knowing that it was most likely going to be tied with the other victims, same suspect in this. And if we were going to obtain any type of evidence, our best shot was to get it out of this particular house.
Fingerprints were also lifted from a vehicle parked in the latest victim's garage. At autopsy, it was revealed there were marks left by the duct tape used to tie her hands behind her back. She had been strangled. All but 2 of her ribs were broken and her neck was snapped. They also determined she was sexually assaulted. Inside her throat, the medical examiner found a single hair. As detectives gathered their evidence, news of the murder spread. Detective Tom Holly received an anonymous tip.
While I was finishing up my paperwork, I was working late last night, and I got this anonymous phone call from a female who tried to disguise her voice and kind of only whispered. But she said she knew who the killer was from Spring Hill, and she gave me the name of Edwin Caprat.
So we should have some good quality prints to compare with those of that, what is his name, Caprat, you said?
Caprat.
It's going to hinge on forensics at this point.
Forensic specialist Gary Kimball compared the prints recovered at the crime scene with those on file. Detectives learned Caprat had a long history of arrests.
Well, he does have a criminal history. He's a convicted felon out of Hillsborough County. And 91, we have a homicide, willful kill, first degree, robbery, and forgery from Tampa PD. And
They also learned Caprat performed odd jobs for several of the victims. One detective remembered interviewing him at the first crime scene. Kimball believed he was onto something. Forensic supervisor Russ Knodel examined the findings, looking for certain characteristics, such as identical loops and patterns. They were eager to share the news.
We got some good news. Gary Kimball just made 2 of your late cases off the Caprat case. Caprat is your man. He's the guy.
But since Caprat was a local handyman and worked for several of the victims, his prints could be easily explained.
And one off the car.
in the garage.
They needed more.
Wonderful. He's your man. That's great. Scratch, too. So, Daniel, another one, man?
For 2 weeks, Caprat was placed under 24-hour surveillance. Their goal was to collect more physical evidence. After he left a local bar, detectives took one of Caprat's cigarette butts, hoping to match his DNA to the saliva on the cigarettes recovered at the crime scene, and to the hair found lodged in the victim's throat. The DNA matched. It was the connection they needed. Detectives obtained an arrest warrant and went to the suspect's most recent residence. Michael Caprat was placed under arrest for the most recent arson murder of Rita Talbot. In a room lined with photos of the crime scenes and the many files police had collected, detectives questioned Caprat.
Prior to even interviewing, we knew that he was our guy, so we pushed forward with it. And Detective Douglas and myself kind of took on the good guy, bad guy detective.
At first, he denied everything. But when confronted with the evidence, he confessed.
Once we started our interview, we couldn't shut him up, basically. He just talked on and on and on and on.
During the 3-hour interview, he confessed to murders of 3 women, as well as the 4 arsons. Caprat was charged with 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 3 counts of rape.
The forensics evidence clinches the case for us, but there's nothing like a confession.
According to his confession, Michael Caprat chose elderly victims because he believed they were vulnerable. He broke into their homes and crept into their rooms. He would restrain his victims with duct tape, then proceed to rape and beat them. He poured rubbing alcohol that he took from their own bathrooms, spilling it on and around their beds. He then lit a match. For his crimes, Michael Caprat was sentenced to death. On April 19, 1995, he was killed by another death row inmate. Fire can be used as a powerful weapon. Killers who choose it know little is left in its wake.
Hey guys, how we doing?
Though some hope it will successfully hide their crimes, many perpetrators discover forensic evidence can survive long after the fire is out. And their trial by fire leads directly to justice. In Northern California, a fire rages in the middle of the night. A woman's charred body is discovered in the smoldering aftermath. But how she turned up dead remains a mystery. Detectives turn to forensic science in the hopes of uncovering the answers to their many questions. When investigators start sifting through the ashes, they have no idea it will lead to a trail of deception. This is a case of out-and-out lies, and not one, but 2 cold-blooded murders. When people trust their killer with their secrets, their money, and their lives, it can very well turn out to be a tragic case of misplaced loyalty. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. The city of Berkeley, California is well known for its hippie counterculture and bohemian lifestyle. Nestled in the rolling hills just across the bridge from San Francisco, it's a magnet for people of all walks of life. Criminals can hide in plain sight, making it a perfect place to cover up an insidious crime. In the early morning hours of June 25th, 1994, a loud explosion rocked the home of James Hutchings. It was 4 in the morning, and his next-door neighbor Virginia Bailey's house was on fire. He rushed to call the fire department, but took consolation in the knowledge that Bailey was out of town.
Yeah, there's a fire. My neighbor's house is on fire. Yes, 2912.
Do you know who lives there? Virginia Bailey? Is she at home right now? She's out of town. Okay, we're sending the fire department. We're on the way. Thank you.
Dispatchers immediately dispatched the Berkeley Fire Department to the scene. Firefighters rushed to what they thought was an unoccupied home. When they arrived, shooting flames were visible through the window. Working deliberately for several hours, the firemen extinguished the fire. Firefighters entered the house to make sure the fire was out. They noticed the majority of the damage from the blaze was in the dining room. Deputy Fire Marshal Wayne Inouye was on the scene.
When I got on the scene, I found a 2-story residential dwelling. I went into the first floor, and the first floor wasn't that badly damaged. I proceeded up to the second floor, and that's where the majority of the fire damage was. There was a lot of smoke damage on the second floor, and in the dining room, there was heavy fire damage.
Hey Chuck, shine your light in there. Over to the right. What is that? Body. Is it a body?
It was there they made a shocking discovery. A body lying face down in the smoldering debris, clearly dead.
We've got a confirmed 8900 in this location. Notify the fire marshals. Better get the coroner started up this way.
They also noticed something odd about the scene. The room was virtually without furniture, and the body was found 6 feet from the fireplace. When firefighters discover a body, they are required to notify the coroner's office. Coroner technicians arrived on the scene. They noticed the victim had severe burns on both her head and her hands. James Hutchings was shocked to learn that his neighbor might have perished in the fire.
I heard a huge explosion. Heard an explosion?
He knew Virginia was supposed to be in Salt Lake City for a wedding. And if she were home, he wondered why her car was not in the driveway.
When you looked out the window, did you see anybody out there?
No.
Anybody running from the house?
Nope, just flames.
How about
flames? A lot of smoke.
With what they learned from the neighbor, investigators now turned to science to piece together the events that led to a tragic outcome. An autopsy was performed at the State Crime Lab in Berkeley, California. Even though Virginia Bailey was reportedly out of town, forensic experts identified the body using X-rays. The victim was Virginia Bailey. She was home at the time of the fire. But other evidence quickly deemed the exam anything but routine. Upon looking at the body, the first thing the ME noticed was severe decomposition, a finding inconsistent with the person who supposedly just died.
I think I'd like to look at the x-rays. We're going to do, so we're going to pick this up right here.
Even more telling were maggots found in the chest cavity and on the clothing of the corpse. Maggots usually take somewhere between 24 to 48 hours to appear, and do so only on dead bodies. But there could be no logical reason they would appear on the charred body of a fire victim so soon after her death. Dr. Paul Herman of the coroner's office reviewed the autopsy results and examined the photographs.
There was something peculiar about this case because there was evidence of decomposition of the body, even to the point that there were some maggots present on the body and in the clothing, indicating that this person had died long before this fire had occurred.
Since the autopsy revealed the presence of maggots, entomologist Jeffrey Wells was brought in to help establish time of death. Due to their size, he was able to determine that Bailey died at least 3 days before she appeared to be killed in the fire.
If you estimate the age of a maggot found on a body, this gives you a pretty good minimum time since death. The reason for this is flies almost never deposit their eggs or larvae on a live person. Almost always the person must be dead when that happens. If I can estimate the age of a maggot, that gives me a minimum time since death. For example, if I pluck a maggot off of a corpse and I am pretty sure that it is 3 days old, almost certainly that person has been dead for at least 3 days.
Dr. Wells definitively concluded that Virginia Bailey didn't die in the fire. Investigators' worst fears were coming to light. The case was now a criminal matter, and at the Berkeley Police Department, Inspector Al Bierce was assigned the file. Things clearly didn't add up, and Bierce needed to find out what or who had killed Virginia Bailey.
If she had died naturally, it would have been impossible for this fire to have occurred as a natural outgrowth of her death. For example, if she was walking across the room with some kind of a material and then suffered a heart attack, fell, started the fire, there wasn't going to be any decomposition there.
Bierce's first move was to meet with the victim's brother, who had some questions of his own. They began to create a timeline leading up to Virginia's death.
When was the last time that you talked to her by phone?
He hadn't heard from his sister for weeks before the fire.
He always got a call from his sister on his birthday. He didn't get a call. That was totally out of character for her.
Virginia and her brother were extremely close and had recently attended a friend's wedding.
Hello there. I just want both of you to know that I love
Her brother believed that something didn't sit right about his sister's disappearance.
see that both of you are just made for each other.
He said the two usually spoke all the time, yet he had left messages on her answering machine and heard nothing back from her. Virginia's brother told Inspector Bierce that Christine Lloyd, Virginia's financial advisor, had been house-sitting for his sister. He also told him that some of Virginia's furniture was missing from her house.
That's all I've got for now. I know where you are down at the motel.
Inspector Bierce was faced with many questions. He was at the beginning of a complicated investigation. Bierce needed to uncover evidence to find out if someone had killed Virginia Bailey and tried to make it look like an accidental fire death. And perhaps what he was looking for was buried in the ashes of the fire. A deadly fire ravaged the home of Virginia Bailey, and investigators grew suspicious. After only a preliminary investigation, Berkeley Police Inspector Al Bierce thought he had a murder on his hands. Autopsy reports revealed the presence of maggots on a body found at the scene of the fire. Scientists conclusively proved that Virginia Bailey had already been dead for at least 3 days before the fire started. Inspector Bierce decided to visit the scene of the crime firsthand. When he arrived, the fire investigator pointed out burn patterns.
There's no charring on the wood or anything, so it leads to believe that it didn't start here at the fireplace.
Things did not add up.
So this will be real important that we get this done.
They noticed evidence of pour patterns near the body.
Did we come in with a sniffer that night?
This would indicate the presence of an accelerant.
It was poured over the body.
And perhaps the most telling sign, the body was discovered over 6 feet from the fireplace.
I'm seeing it right here. Right
If the fire began in the fireplace, there should be burn marks that led to the body. There were none. The area directly surrounding the body was suspiciously intact. The investigator believed this was arson. He hoped those closest to Virginia could provide him with information as to how and why she died in the fire.
I had something I wanted to show you, to talk to you
He
about
asked
something.
Christine Lloyd, the victim's financial advisor and best friend, to meet him there.
One thing from the other day, when we
She was house sitting for Virginia.
you were coming into the house, you said you came in. Any irregularities?
When
in this
Christine
area?
Lloyd arrived, she told Inspector Bierce she and Virginia were close friends, and she had been her financial advisor for about 10 years.
Everything seemed normal.
Okay.
But there was something else that I needed to show.
Christine was watching the house while Virginia was in San Francisco the week before the fire.
It was pretty much in place at the time.
But she said she never saw Virginia's body in the dining room.
There was something else that I needed to show you.
Christine said she went back to the house right after the fire. She and a friend were there trying to rescue Virginia's items from the burned house. It was then they saw something in the downstairs apartment that Virginia usually rented. Christine said this was unusual because the apartment was vacant. She showed Bierce what she had found in the downstairs rental unit. Christine said she was worried that someone had been staying downstairs.
Before the fire.
Before
She told the detective she noticed something disturbing about the condition of the rental apartment's refrigerator.
Oh my God.
Whoa.
How did this happen?
Christine Lloyd pointed out the refrigerator, and she said that just a week before, it had been totally clean and the shelves had been inside. When she showed it to me, the shelves were out of it, and there was a residue on the bottom of the refrigerator, suggestive of the fact that something had been stored there. And she was telling me that nothing had been stored there the last time she had seen it. How many days before the fire were you here?
I was here a couple of days ago.
In the bedroom, Bierce found a terrible mess.
Looks like somebody's been living in here.
There was a mattress on the floor and bottles strewn everywhere.
Look in here. Look at this.
The uninvited resident had left the apartment in disarray. The refrigerator contained what appeared to be a dark liquid residue that looked like blood. To determine what it was, crime technicians performed a luminol test. Also in the refrigerator, what appeared to be a small clump of hair riddled with maggots. Inspector Bierce had the technician remove the hair clump and take a swabbing of the red liquid.
Swab that liquid.
The samples were sent to the lab for further examination. But it was quickly determined that the substance wasn't blood and the hair did not belong to Virginia. And Bierce made another unusual discovery.
Okay.
The smoke detector for the downstairs unit had been unplugged.
Okay.
Get started. This looks pretty staged.
Oh, yeah. I went into that room with a very skeptical eye, and it looked staged. That was put there so that somebody would think that somebody had been crashing there, and potentially the person who was crashing there was the person who'd gone upstairs and killed the victim.
Bierce's suspicions continued to grow. Little things about the scene troubled him, like how unusually neat, strategic, and organized the squatter's mess seemed. That despite all the bottles strewn about, there were no bottle caps. There were also no fingerprints on the bottles. To him, the whole scene felt manufactured. Jeffrey Wells examined the hair found in the refrigerator for the presence of maggots. The maggots he found were alive. Types of maggots vary. Those found in the downstairs refrigerator were scuttlefly maggots, different from the flesh fly maggots found on Virginia Bailey's body. The ones in the apartment were insects attracted to rotting food, as well as human remains. All this information troubled Inspector Bierce. But perhaps the most puzzling was the fact that Christine Lloyd said she hadn't seen Virginia's body. After all, she had been dead for at least 3 days. If the body was in the refrigerator, that would support Christine's story. But the science wasn't adding up. If the body was not hidden in the refrigerator, where had it been?
I'm saying, okay, some part of this doesn't make any sense. Either she's aware that the body is there and has played some role in the body being there, or somebody is coming in after the fact and planted the body there. It's not going to make a great deal of sense to me.
Inspector Bierce was beginning to think Christine Lloyd knew more. Perhaps she could shed more light on Virginia's whereabouts before the fire started. He decided to look a little harder at Christine's story. Virginia Bailey was found dead in her Berkeley, California home, and the circumstances surrounding her death were suspicious. The presence of maggots on the body proved she had been dead for some time before the fire. And the story told by the victim's friend, Christine Lloyd, was not adding up.
Come on in, Inspector.
It looked as if Inspector Al Bierce was piecing together a murder.
So how can I help you?
Well, as we talked
The
about
detective met with her to ask her some follow-up questions.
Find out what I can about her habits. She put herself in the house every single day. She put herself into the house as late as 14 hours before the fire. I've got a coroner who's telling me, or who has told me, that the victim's dead for at least 2 days. She's found in an area where Christine Lloyd would have had to have passed through the room within feet of the body to feed the cats and to get the mail. I'm going to leave my card.
It seemed unlikely to Bierce that Virginia could have died of natural causes and lay there for days before the fire ignited.
You can call me or have them call me.
It was time to do some legwork, to learn more about the victim. Bierce began questioning friends and business associates of Virginia's. He started with her co-worker, Mary Cates, who said Virginia wasn't scheduled to go to San Francisco, as Christine had said. Mary also told Inspector Bierce that Virginia had been missing work lately.
Very much out of character, no.
Since this was completely out of character, she said she called Virginia to make sure she was okay. She left a message on her answering machine, but never received a call back from Virginia.
She informed me that...
But said Christine Lloyd called her to tell her Virginia was out of town.
I believe she was at school.
Bierce spoke to several of Virginia's friends, and they all had the same story. When they would call Virginia, they'd get a call back from Christine Lloyd.
Good.
Since Bierce determined Virginia had many friends who were concerned about her whereabouts, he found it odd that no one had actually been able to reach her in the days prior to the fire.
She had missed appointments on the 17th, 18th, and 19th?
Yes, correct.
One friend, Alicia Jackson, was so concerned she headed over to her house to make sure she was okay. But there was no answer. Only a note on the door saying she was in San Francisco. She thought this was odd, but left her own note, hoping to hear back from her missing friend.
We're obviously
Bierce was puzzled.
hearing from anybody we can.
Although all her friends were being helpful, no one offered anything that gave the investigation focus.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for coming.
Virginia's brother came back to the police station and offered up a charred piece of evidence. It was Virginia's answering machine, presumably full of messages from concerned friends.
Fire damage to the cassette, pretty well warped.
Inspector Bierce sent the tape to the DOJ crime lab in the hopes of salvaging the burned cassette.
Not sure what we're going to be able to get out.
Perhaps the messages on the machine would lead to answers as to why every time someone tried to make contact with Virginia, they made contact with Christine Lloyd instead.
Be in touch with what we get.
Bierce ran a background check on Christine Lloyd. She came up clean, except for a minor traffic violation. Since Christine was Virginia's financial advisor, Inspector Bierce decided to get a warrant to examine the victim's financial records.
Come on in. Have a seat.
Bierce went to Virginia's bank for answers. Years of experience taught Bierce, study a victim's finances and you'll likely uncover a motive. Virginia's bank activity had reached a fever pitch in the weeks before her death. Large checks were written against Virginia's account, not only to Christine, but also to a woman named Myrtle Lloyd.
About 50% of the proceeds of that account went to Christine Lloyd.
One peculiar thing Bierce noted was a certified foreclosure letter dated the 13th of June. Christine was responsible for making sure all of the bills were paid on time.
Certified mail.
And she had given him no indication that Virginia was in such severe financial trouble.
Card when she opened the bank.
And another red flag. Something that made no sense for a woman who was in dire financial straits and about to lose her home. A flurry of checks written in June. The end of a 6-month spending spree totaling thousands of dollars. In total, 4 checks were made out to Christine and Myrtle Lloyd. Some dated after Virginia's death. Bierce believed he found a motive: embezzlement. Now he needed some kind of smoking gun. Bierce asked Virginia's manager for ATM surveillance tapes at Virginia's bank.
More checks to draw. I will get back to you with...
He also pored over every financial document he could find.
Do we have one for bleach and...
And there, among the detailed receipts from Virginia's account, came a startling discovery.
For 2136.
Inspector Bierce found receipts for both an accelerant and a garden hose.
Given the date of that purchase and the fact that an accelerant was very possibly used in the ignition of the fire, it provided a nexus between that purchase and the fact that the fire had occurred.
For bleach and...
It looked as if Christine had been using Virginia's account. And the purchase of 2 40-ounce cans of lighter fluid and a hose on her account just days before the fire was quickly turning friend into suspect.
We got the surveillance tapes from the ATM machine. Oh. We can put it
Can you hook it up?
on. Yeah.
Bierce's
Let's look
next
at it.
step was to watch the surveillance video provided by Virginia's bank.
Have you queued this up already?
Yeah, this is already queued up.
It contained no surprise. Clear as day, there was Christine Lloyd signing Virginia's checks and deposit slips on checks made out to herself. The checks were in the exact amount of Virginia's missing mortgage payments. One of the checks was dated 3 days before Virginia's death. Yet it was cashed 3 days after her death. It was made out to Myrtle Lloyd. Bierce needed to know who this woman was and if she and Christine were working together to steal Virginia's money. Since their last names were the same, he presumed the two were related. Bierce did a records check on Myrtle Lloyd. What he found out was perhaps the most disturbing thing yet in this perplexing case. Myrtle Lloyd was Christine's mother, and Myrtle Lloyd was dead. It appeared that Christine was not only signing checks on Virginia's account for herself, she was also signing checks made out to a dead woman, her own mother. Bierce visited with the Oakland police, who looked into Myrtle Lloyd's death. He wanted details. Captain Ralph Lacer of the Oakland Police Department remembered her story. He told Bierce that Myrtle had been found dead in her bathtub with severe bruises to her face and lacerations to her head.
And she was doing some financial things for her, and it's looking right now like she was taking...
Because there were no obvious signs of foul play, and police believed Christine's story, the coroner ruled Myrtle's death an accident.
After finding no sign of forced entry in the residence, there was no loss in the residence, or no one appeared to have kind of rummaged through the residence. It came out that we didn't see anything that showed it was a hands of another, and at this point they ruled that it was an accidental death.
Maybe would have come across as an accidental death, but knowing what I
Then Bierce learned that Christine Lloyd had found her mother's body.
She had seen the mother the day before, and that she had left and done some shopping, and then she was bringing some groceries back to the house.
According to the July 1991 police reports, Christine Lloyd said she returned home from the grocery store.
Hello? What's the grocery store, y'all? Mom?
She was surprised when her mom was nowhere to be found.
Mom? Mom? Mom?
It was when she entered the bathroom that she made the startling discovery of her mother's body. Then, things just clicked for the detective. He instinctively knew he had a second murder on his hands, and he was determined to get the evidence necessary to prove it. While investigating the death of Virginia Bailey,
that was my first impression.
Inspector Al Bierce believed he had uncovered another murder, and he was convinced the same killer committed both crimes. The woman who had been so helpful from the beginning was now a suspect.
At that point in the investigation, I knew that she'd killed my victim in Berkeley, and I knew that she had killed her mother 3 years before. And I knew that she had done a very good job of concealing that death 3 years ago to make it look like an accidental death, not murder.
He was beginning to put it all together, but there were still some unanswered questions. Bierce went to the Oakland coroner's office to find out more.
And what I found...
Dr. Paul Herman performed the autopsy on Myrtle Lloyd.
When I walked in the bathroom, I would have expected to find a great deal of blood spattered about in the bathroom because of these injuries to the head.
This was not what he thought he'd find. After all, the victim had severe head wounds. there should have been blood everywhere. But then Dr. Herman saw the smallest of clues. He also noticed more signs that the scene had been meticulously cleaned.
This bathroom was clean. The water had been drained from the tub, and there was some debris from decomposition and probably blood at the bottom of the tub, but no spattering of blood around there at all. And that's what I would have expected to see. And expose the bone. But there are
Myrtle
others that are
Lloyd was
horizontal,
killed
so
by
they
7
obviously
separate
didn't
lacerations
all
to the back of her head.
one way. There had to be either movement of the head
Christine
or
explained that her
movement
mother
of
was
the
prone to seizures and said that she had fallen in the bathtub.
And in addition, she had a laceration of her forehead, which
Bierce knew things were not adding up.
fractures.
And after visiting Oakland, his suspicions about Christine escalated.
As you can see, some of these
He believed the crime scene was too neat, almost in direct contrast to the scene in Berkeley.
Yeah, they're on both sides, and some of
But both appeared staged nonetheless.
they're crosswise across the back of the head.
To test their suspicions, investigators spoke with Myrtle Lloyd's doctors to determine if she had been ill or had any known conditions that would make her unsteady on her feet.
Physical exams.
What they found out would break the cold case wide open. Myrtle was in excellent health and had no history of seizures. By now, Detective Bierce was convinced of Christine Lloyd's guilt. He was ready to make an arrest. What he needed was a charge. At this point, there was not enough direct evidence to make a murder arrest. Since Christine had signed Virginia Bailey's name on checks, his best bet was forgery. He turned to handwriting expert Verl Truman, a forensic document examiner with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and asked him to look at the checks for fraud.
Handwriting examination is basically a side-by-side comparison. The basis for the identification of handwriting is the fact that no two persons share the same combination of individual identifying handwriting characteristics. We look for various features and habits of the writer. We look for the way the person makes beginning strokes, ending strokes, or connecting strokes between letters and letter combinations. We look at things such as the relative height ratio and proportion of letters and in relation to other letters.
He found subtle differences between their handwriting styles, which Truman said were patterns and traits that every individual develops over the years.
Now, these characteristics, it's very difficult to cast off your habits when you're either imitating the handwriting of another person or if you're trying to disguise your own writing. Usually some of your habits will still show through.
And Christine was unable to completely disguise hers.
Understand you got something for me?
Yes, I
But
believe I
perhaps
do.
the most telling sign was not an actual letter or a word,
Notice that she makes a star
but a
formation,
unique
dollar
and
sign.
personal signature symbol.
And this one, which I believe is Virginia Bailey used a star as a dollar sign in her writing, and she constructed that character beginning and ending at the lower left corner or 7 o'clock position. Christine Lloyd, on the other hand, did it completely opposite. She began it and started it at the lower right. That was a feature that she just happened to miss.
Inspector Bierce now had proof of forgery. But what he needed was proof of murder. Bierce decided to take another look at the days prior to the fire. Christine was the only one with Virginia's house key, and the only one who seemed to know anything about Virginia's whereabouts. She had even been returning Virginia's phone messages. At the State Crime Lab, technicians worked to restore the message tape from Virginia Bailey's answering machine.
Stick around. I'll play this.
Investigators were now able to retrieve the messages, although they had no idea what they'd find. By comparing the phone records to the voice messages, Inspector Bierce was able to piece together the chain of events leading up to and following Virginia's murder.
Hey, Virginia, it's me. I haven't heard from you in a while. Where are you? Call me.
The calls reflected a growing concern about Virginia's disappearance on June 13th, 12 days before the fire. And oddly, many of the outgoing calls Bierce found on Virginia's phone records began on that very day.
There was information that came to me during the course of the investigation that suggested that the victim had died on June 13th. That was the last time anybody ever talked to her. And it was the time through phone records that I showed that she had made a call to Christine.
The pieces were falling into place. Bierce felt he was close to being able to make an arrest. He paid a visit to another one of Virginia's neighbors, Sam Watson. Watson told of helping Christine carry a large dining room table, as well as other items from Virginia's house before the fire. She then sold them at a yard sale.
You selling this table too?
Christine had denied having any idea what had happened to that table.
Hello.
Hi, how are you? Good.
I guess it was about 2 days before.
Every part of Christine Lloyd's story seemed suspect. Investigators believed she was in a frenzy of greed, intent on fully taking over her friend's assets through any means possible.
Step towards me, ma'am. Step towards me. Keep walking. You stop. Turn around with your back towards me. Face the house. Face the house.
In early December of 1994, Inspector Al Bierce arrested Christine Lloyd for murder and took her into custody.
Take you to the car. Do you have any weapons? Do you have knives? Guns?
Bierce was convinced that Christine Lloyd had masterminded 2 murders.
Hi, Christine.
But he only had enough evidence to bring her in for the murder of Virginia Bailey. He believed she was motivated by money and greed.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything
And he
you say
wanted to see
can and
Christine Lloyd behind bars.
You have the right to an attorney. To have that attorney
Christine
present
Lloyd
when you
refused to speak to police.
can't afford it.
She refused to take a polygraph test.
Charge. You understand those rights as I
Instead, she asked for her attorney. She was processed into the system. Although Christine Lloyd was sticking to her guns regarding Virginia Bailey, when asked about her mother, she shook her head and told Bierce he was wrong. She said she was a loving daughter who doted on her mother and would never do anything to harm her. Apparently, Christine Lloyd was convincing. At the time of the arrest, the district attorney's office didn't feel comfortable going ahead and prosecuting the case.
What's your name? Christine.
They didn't feel the evidence was strong enough to get a conviction. Her immediate release was ordered.
Please check and make sure everything is there.
As she walked out of the jail, Inspector Al Bierce despaired.
I knew that she had embezzled from her mother, leading up to the murder of her mother. I knew that she had embezzled from my victim, leading to her murder. And from a personal standpoint, that wasn't something I could let go of.
Convinced he was dealing with a murderer who had already killed twice, Inspector Bierce wasn't about to let it rest.
Yes, you are.
He needed more evidence. He turned to forensic scientists to help him bring this killer to justice. Berkeley County investigator Al Bierce pieced together a story of greed, lies, and murder. He was convinced Christine Lloyd killed both her best friend and her own mother. Now, despite nearly a year on the case, hundreds of hours of legwork and compelling evidence,
Please check and make sure.
he was watching her go free.
Yes, you are.
I knew she was guilty, and I couldn't let go.
Good night, guys. Night, Glenn.
Al Bierce was now working all hours, trying to plug any holes in what he thought was an airtight case against Christine Lloyd.
All right, Al, let's go.
The district attorney's office refused to prosecute the case, stating the evidence was circumstantial and it would not hold up in court. But Al Bierce had worked too hard to let this one slip through his fingers.
By the time I got through, when I was at that point in the investigation, I knew that she'd killed my victim in Berkeley, and I knew that she had killed her mother 3 years before. And I knew that she had done a very good job of concealing that death 3 years ago to make it look like an accidental death, not murder.
Bierce approached Thomas Rogers, the head of the trial staff at the DA's office in Alameda County. After hearing the details of Bierce's investigation, he too became determined to bring the case to justice.
I made a commitment that I was going to try the case. In our business, many of the cases are much more interesting than what we see on television. There's a tremendous human drama involved. For anybody who is curious, you have a woman who's 55 years old with no record. Why did she kill her best friend?
This was the question puzzling investigators for over a year.
Hello, Al. Tom Rogers.
But as Bierce and Rogers discovered, it all came down to money.
When he went through the receipts, he should be done.
Christine Lloyd had been cashing her mother's civil service pension checks. And the men believed that once Virginia Bailey confronted Christine about the house foreclosure, it was only a matter of time before authorities began looking into Christine's finances and found out about Myrtle Lloyd. But despite all the circumstantial evidence, the clear motive of embezzlement, and the testimony of the handwriting analyst, it would be a tough case to try. There was no cause of death, no eyewitnesses, no smoking gun. D.A. Rogers decided to take one last look at the pile of evidence Inspector Bierce had uncovered. After weeks of combing through the findings, he was convinced. The final link to justice and punishment would come down to a tiny piece of living evidence.
The most compelling evidence was the entomology evidence. If we did not have the entomology evidence, we never would have been able to prove the case.
The fact that maggots will only feed on a dead body was the only piece of conclusive proof that Virginia was dead long before the fire. But it was the proof that made Rogers feel comfortable enough to try the case. And it was the one hole in Christine Lloyd's story which all the other lies would come rushing through. She placed herself in the house during the time of Virginia's death and the time of the fire. This would be the crux of the prosecutor's case. That Christine Lloyd had committed Virginia Bailey's murder and spent 2 weeks manufacturing an elaborate crime scene to cover her tracks. In July of 1995, 1 year after the fire that killed her best friend, Virginia Bailey, Christine Lloyd was once again arrested.
Are there any weapons?
Right to remain silent.
But this time, she was headed to trial. Once again, Lloyd refused to speak to the man who had made it his mission to put her behind bars.
You're getting one more chance at your side of the story. It's a pretty quiet trip coming in.
But by now, Bierce and D.A. Rogers had fully patched together what had happened to Virginia Bailey and the events leading up to her murder.
Assuming you're not going to be talking to me.
Near trial, we re-investigated and were able to prove through statements and circumstantial evidence that clearly Christine Lloyd had killed her mother. And that the motive then for killing Virginia Bailey was to avoid a re-examination of the mother's death.
Virginia Bailey had no idea her dear friend Christine Lloyd had been embezzling from her. So when she came home on the afternoon of June 13th, 1994, to find a registered foreclosure note from her bank, Virginia was undoubtedly surprised and angry.
She panicked. She phoned Christine and she said, you know, you're my financial advisor. What is the deal here? There was a 3.5-minute call to Christine's house in Martinez.
At that point, Christine knew she was caught, and it wouldn't be long before everyone knew the deadly secrets she had been hiding for 3 years. She showed up at the house intent on murder.
The bank for foreclosing on the house. I wrote the checks out in paper.
Using a blunt object, she brutally struck Virginia until she was dead. It would now be up to a jury to determine if Christine Lloyd was the murderous woman Al Bierce was convinced she was. But Al Bierce also wanted justice for Myrtle Lloyd and uncovered that Christine was the sole beneficiary of a $100,000 life insurance policy. So as Christine sat in jail awaiting trial for one murder, the investigation continued on the second. This was enough to indict once again for murder. Driven by the same greed, Christine had inflicted a beating on her elderly mother. Christine Lloyd was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of arson. She received 2 consecutive life sentences. In planning, executing, and covering up their crimes, sometimes murderers think too much. Sometimes it is this over-planning that leads investigators to their front doors. And as long as those investigators are listening for clues, they'll have the forensic resources to back up their hunches. And clever killers will continue to be brought to justice.